What's the craziest reason a wedding got called off at the last minute? Story 1. I had a friend who was getting married to this guy she had been dating for about 2 years. The wedding was planned to perfection. Venue, dress, guests, the whole shebang. Everything was ready. The night before the wedding, she gets a phone call from her fiancé's ex-girlfriend. Turns out they had been in contact secretly for months leading up to the wedding, and the ex-girlfriend told her that he had been cheating on her for the last 6 months. My friend was devastated, but she went through with the wedding rehearsal anyway. The next morning, she showed up at the venue, but as soon as the groom walked into the room, she just walked up to him, slapped him in front of everyone, and called off the wedding. We all expected her to burst into tears, but she just walked out with her friends and never spoke to him again. She didn't even take back the dress. She just left it there, and it was a huge shock to all the guests. Story 2. I was at my cousin's wedding, and it was the most bizarre thing I've ever witnessed. The bride had a cousin who was like a sister to her. They were super close, so when the bride asked her to be the maid of honor, it was a no-brainer. The morning of the wedding, everything seemed perfect. The bride was getting ready, the groom was nervous but smiling, and all the guests were arriving. Right before the ceremony began, the maid of honor pulled the bride aside and admitted something shocking. She told the bride that she had been secretly having an affair with the groom for the past year. They had been in love, and she couldn't keep it a secret anymore. The bride was crushed. There was a lot of crying, screaming, and then the bride just turned around and walked out. The groom didn't even chase her. It was a total disaster, and no one knew what to do afterward. The whole event was called off and most people left immediately. The worst part was that the maid of honor tried to apologize, but the bride refused to speak to her ever again. Story 3. This one happened to a close friend of mine. She was marrying her college sweetheart, and they had everything booked. Their wedding was going to be a huge affair, and she'd been planning every detail for over a year. A day before the wedding, her soon-to-be husband got a call from his ex-girlfriend. He went outside to take the call, and after a while, he returned looking completely different, pale and nervous. My friend asked him what was going on, and he admitted to her that his ex was pregnant with his child. He was torn between marrying her and taking responsibility for the baby. He told my friend that he needed some time to figure things out. Right there, the wedding was called off. It was the most surreal moment. My friend was heartbroken but also thankful she found out the truth before saying, "I do." She left the venue in tears, and the groom never showed up to explain himself. The entire family was in shock, and the wedding turned into a family disaster. Story 4. A wedding I attended was called off in the most unexpected way. The couple had been planning their wedding for months, and everything was set to go. The bride had just walked down the aisle, and the ceremony was beginning when she suddenly stopped. She looked straight at her fiancé and said, "I can't do this." The entire room froze. Everyone thought she was joking, but she wasn't. Turns out, she had been experiencing major second thoughts in the days leading up to the wedding, but she didn't want to let anyone down. The tipping point came when, just before the ceremony started, her fiancé pulled her aside and said, "If you leave me at the altar, I'll make your life hell." The bride realized that this wasn't a healthy relationship and decided she'd rather deal with the embarrassment of calling off the wedding than live in a toxic marriage. She left him standing at the altar, and a few months later she moved away to start fresh. It was the most powerful thing I've ever witnessed. Story 5. A friend of mine was at a wedding where the groom called it off at the last minute. It all started when the bride's mother became very ill a week before the wedding. It was heartbreaking, but she insisted that the wedding go on as planned because her mother would want it. On the morning of the ceremony, the groom was nowhere to be found. After some frantic searching, the bride's family realized that he had left. He'd disappeared completely. No texts, no calls, nothing. Turns out, he had been in a relationship with a woman who was very close to the bride's family but had never met her. The groom had been seeing her in secret, and when he found out the bride's mother was in the hospital, he panicked. He left the wedding because he didn't want to marry her if her mother might not make it. He didn't even have the decency to call it off before the ceremony started. The bride was devastated, but she ended up calling the wedding off herself and decided to take care of her family instead. It was incredibly shocking to everyone. Story 6. A friend of mine got invited to a wedding that was the talk of the town. Everyone was excited because the couple had been together for 10 years, and it seemed like the perfect match. The wedding was being held at a beautiful vineyard, and there was so much hype surrounding it. However, about an hour before the ceremony, something completely unexpected happened. The bride's father, who was very close to her, pulled her aside in private. He had been acting strangely all day, but no one thought much of it. When he sat her down, he revealed something shocking. He wasn't sure if her fiancé was really the man he thought he was. It turned out years ago, the groom had been involved in a serious hit-and-run accident, something he had kept hidden from everyone, including the bride. Her father knew about it because he had been contacted by the police when the investigation was reopened, after a new witness came forward. The bride was stunned. The groom had been a model citizen ever since, but she didn't know how to process this revelation. She confronted him, and he didn't deny it, but he claimed he had changed and it was a mistake from his past. The bride, torn between the man she loved and her father's concerns, decided she couldn't go through with the wedding. She called it off in front of all the guests, who were left in utter shock. What made this situation even crazier was that the groom didn't seem as devastated as everyone expected. In fact, he seemed more relieved than anything, which made the whole situation even more unsettling. The bride ended up taking a long time to heal, but her relationship with her father was stronger than ever. The groom left the venue with his family and the whole event was a complete disaster. Story 7. This one's a wild one. I was working as a server at a wedding for a couple who seemed to have it all together. The venue was extravagant, the guests were fancy, and everything looked perfect. However, the wedding came to a screeching halt just before the vows. I was preparing drinks in the bar area when I overheard a conversation that immediately made my stomach drop. The groom was talking to his best man, and what I heard was jaw-dropping. Apparently, he had been receiving texts all morning from his ex-girlfriend, who had just had a baby and was claiming that he was the father. He was denying it, but it was clear from the conversation that he was deeply shaken and unsure about what to do. Not long after that conversation, the bride walked into the bar area to speak with the groom. She had clearly overheard something because she looked both confused and furious. As soon as she asked him about it, the groom started to panic. He swore he hadn't been in contact with his ex recently, but the bride was having none of it. She demanded answers right then and there in front of all the guests. Even though the ceremony was about to begin, the groom looked like he was about to collapse from stress, and he finally admitted to everything. The baby, the ex-girlfriend, the lies. The bride, in disbelief, turned to the guests and made an announcement. The wedding is off. The guests, most of them stunned, awkwardly began to leave, while the bride walked out, her face a mix of betrayal and heartbreak. The groom just stood there, speechless, as his life unraveled before. Story 8. I was at a wedding where the bride's mother was the one to ruin everything. It all started out perfect. The couple seemed so in love, the decorations were flawless, and the guests were all chatting excitedly. But, right before the vows, the bride's mom, who had been acting a bit strangely all day, pulled the groom aside and said something I will never forget. She confessed that years ago she had a one-night stand with the... Not only that, but she was pretty sure that he was actually her child's father, not her husband's. She was deeply afraid of the truth coming out and said she couldn't let her daughter marry someone who might be her son-in-law. The groom was shocked beyond words, but the bride overheard the conversation. In front of the entire congregation, the bride stood up and screamed at her mother, accusing her of being selfish and destroying her happiness. The entire church went dead silent as the bride, trembling, confronted her mother about her past. The groom didn't know what to do but confirmed what her mom had told him earlier. The wedding was called off right there, and everyone awkwardly shuffled out of the venue. Later, it was revealed that a DNA test confirmed the truth. The bride's mother and the groom had shared a secret that they never wanted to come to light. The bride needed months to process everything, but she eventually decided to end all contact with her mother, unable to forgive her for what she had done. It was a complete scandal that no one saw coming. Story 9. One of the most bizarre reasons a wedding was called off happened at a ceremony I was invited to. The couple had been planning their wedding for over a year, and they were high school sweethearts. The entire event was scheduled to take place in a beautiful mansion, with all the details meticulously planned. Guests were arriving, and the bride was getting ready in a separate room. But then, just as the ceremony was supposed to start, the groom walked into the venue with a woman I had never seen before. He stood in front of the guests and, in a moment of complete madness, admitted that he had been in love with the woman he brought with him for over 5 years. Apparently, this woman was his true love, and he was only marrying the bride because of family pressure. The entire room went silent. The bride was in shock. She couldn't believe it. After years of dating, the groom had been secretly seeing someone else and was now confessing it in front of everyone. The bride stood up, crying, and walked out of the venue with her family. The groom tried to chase after her, but she refused to listen. The most shocking part of the whole thing was that the woman the groom brought with him was also his sister's best friend, making it all the more twisted. The wedding was called off and everyone just left. The bride eventually moved on, but she didn't speak to the groom or his family again. Story 10. This one is a bit of a heartbreaker. I was at a wedding where, just as the bride was about to walk down the aisle, she was handed a letter. It was from her fiancé. Apparently, he had been having doubts for weeks but never had the courage to call off the wedding until that moment. The letter said that he was not ready for marriage, and he realized that he was still in love with someone else. The bride was devastated, but she made a bold decision. She walked out onto the aisle anyway, addressed the entire room and said, "I'm not going to marry someone who doesn't want me." She then turned to the groom's family and asked them to leave as well. The ceremony was over before it even started. Guests began to leave the venue, most in tears, but some in complete silence, not knowing what to say. The groom never showed up after the letter was read, and it turned out that he had left the city by the time everyone started to process what had happened. The bride ended up going on a solo honeymoon, completely rethinking her life and moving forward with strength. Months later, she met someone new who appreciated her for who she truly was, and she vowed never to settle again. Story 11. This happened to a colleague of mine, and it's probably one of the strangest wedding cancellations I've ever heard of. The bride and groom were both in their late 20s, had been dating for almost 5 years, and everything seemed perfect. The ceremony was set to take place in a gorgeous chapel, and the guests were already seated. The groom was at the altar, and the bride was just about to walk down the aisle. Suddenly, as the bride entered the church, she froze. She looked at the groom standing at the altar, and instead of continuing, she turned around and walked out of the church. A couple of minutes later, the groom followed her outside, but she wasn't alone. She had been talking to someone on her phone the whole time she was in the church, and when the groom caught up with her, she handed him the phone. It was her ex-boyfriend. Apparently, she had been in touch with him in secret for months, and had even visited him during their engagement. She confessed that she never truly got over him and felt she couldn't go through with the wedding. The groom, stunned and in disbelief, tried to convince her to stay, but she refused. She called off the wedding and the groom left, not saying a word. The most bizarre part of the whole thing was that the bride's ex-boyfriend flew in from another city the night before, hoping that she would call it off and return to him. What made the situation even stranger was that the ex seemed almost too happy about it all, acting like he had been waiting for the moment to strike. The whole wedding was canceled, and people left in shock. The bride, eventually, made peace with her decision but never spoke to the groom again. Story 12. I was a guest at a wedding that almost ended before it even began. It all started when the bride and groom were at the altar, about to exchange vows. Everything had been going smoothly until the officiant asked the groom if he took the bride to be his lawfully wedded wife. The groom froze. His face turned pale, and after a long silence he said, "I can't." Everyone thought it was a joke. Maybe he was getting cold feet, but it was anything but funny. The groom explained in front of all the guests that he had just realized he was still in love with his ex-fiancée. He admitted that the two of them had rekindled their relationship months earlier, but kept it a secret from everyone. The ex had been pressuring him to call off the wedding, and he had been torn between two women for weeks. The bride was in shock, and as the groom's words sunk in, she suddenly started laughing. It wasn't a nervous laugh, but one of disbelief and anger. She walked up to him, slapped him across the face, and walked out of the church, calling the whole thing off. The groom didn't chase after her. The best man, who was a mutual friend, stepped in and told the ex to leave, but he was already gone by then. The bride ended up leaving the church with her friends, completely rejecting any further attempts from the groom to talk to her. It was a nightmare for the groom, who spent the next few weeks trying to apologize. But the bride had made up her mind. There was no going back. Story 13. This one is absolutely unbelievable. A friend of mine went to a wedding where the bride's pet dog caused the entire wedding to be called off. It was a lovely, quiet ceremony, and everything was going according to plan until the bride walked down the aisle with her dog by her side, as she had planned for months. The groom, who had been quite the animal lover, looked completely uncomfortable. After they exchanged a few words, something strange happened. The dog, seemingly out of nowhere, attacked the groom. It wasn't a violent attack, but it was enough to knock him off balance and cause him to fall flat on his back. The guests were laughing, thinking it was part of the ceremony, but the groom was visibly upset and started yelling at the dog. The bride quickly rushed to his side to check on him, but the groom was fuming. He accused the bride of not caring about his safety, pointing out how he had been allergic to dogs his whole life. The bride had been aware of this, but she didn't think the dog would actually interact during the ceremony. In a fit of anger, the groom started arguing with the bride, and things escalated quickly. He walked away from the altar, leaving the bride standing there, red-faced and humiliated. The entire ceremony was halted, and guests were forced to leave the venue. The groom later apologized but said he couldn't marry someone who was so inconsiderate of his well-being. The dog, by the way, was perfectly fine and had no idea what just happened. Story 14. I once heard about a wedding where everything was going as planned until the bride's brother stood up and made a shocking announcement. This wedding was large and extravagant, held at a luxurious country club. Guests were mingling and everything seemed perfect. However, just as the bride was about to walk down the aisle, her brother walked up to the groom and said, "You don't deserve her." The groom froze, and the entire church went silent. The bride's brother went on to explain that he had recently learned that the groom had been secretly borrowing money from their family for months. It wasn't the borrowing itself that was the issue, but the fact that the groom had lied about his finances and was deeply in debt. The groom tried to deny it, but the brother had proof. The tension in the room was palpable, and the bride was visibly shaking. The groom then admitted everything. He had been hiding his financial situation from the bride, hoping she wouldn't find out before the wedding. The bride, heartbroken and furious, called off the wedding right then and there. She publicly declared that she could not marry someone who had been so deceitful. The worst part was that the groom didn't even seem to care all that. He apologized half-heartedly, but didn't even attempt to make it right. The bride walked out of the church with her brother and never spoke to the groom again. It was a wedding that turned into a disaster, and no one could quite believe it happened so public. Story 15. A few years ago, I attended a wedding that I'll never forget. It was a destination wedding in a beautiful tropical location, with a small group of close friends and family. The bride and groom had been together for years, and everyone thought it was the perfect couple. But a few hours before the ceremony, the groom's best man approached the bride in private, looking extremely distressed. The groom had confessed to him earlier that morning that he had been using the bride's trust fund to pay off his gambling debts, and he was now facing serious financial issues. The best man, torn between loyalty to his friend and doing the right thing, told the bride everything. When the bride confronted the groom, he admitted to everything: the gambling addiction, the stolen money, and his inability to control it. He begged her to go through with the wedding anyway, saying that it would all be fine once they were married. But the bride, who had worked hard for years to save up that trust fund, was furious. In front of everyone, she told the groom that the wedding was off and called him out for what he had done. The guests were shocked, and the groom, humiliated and desperate, tried to beg her to reconsider. But the bride was firm, stating she couldn't marry someone who had betrayed her trust in such a way. The wedding was called off right there, and the bride ended up returning to her hotel room, leaving the groom to deal with his mess alone. Story 16. I was attending a wedding for an old college friend, and I was super excited for them. They had been dating for years, and everything seemed perfect. They were getting married in a rustic barn in the countryside, and the ceremony was set to be intimate and beautiful. However, just as the bride was walking down the aisle, there was an unexpected interruption. The groom, who had been standing at the altar with a nervous smile, suddenly turned pale. He looked up at the bride and then at the officiant and said, "I can't do this." The guests, thinking it was a joke, all stared in confusion. But the groom wasn't joking. He started explaining that he had been in contact with his ex-girlfriend in secret for the past month. The ex had been trying to get back together with him, and the groom, in a moment of weakness, had been listening to her. He confessed that he realized he still had feelings for her and couldn't go through with the wedding. The bride was speechless. She just stood there, stunned, her eyes wide in disbelief. After a few seconds, she started crying, but it was more out of anger than sadness. She stormed down the aisle, telling him that he wasn't worthy of her. The groom begged her to stay, but she walked straight out of the barn, leaving the groom in front of a room full of confused guests. What made the situation even more awkward was that the ex-girlfriend showed up shortly after the bride left, walking in with the biggest smirk on her face. The groom, realizing he had just ruined everything, walked off in shame, and the entire wedding was called off. The worst part was that the guests were left without any explanation and had to awkwardly file out of the venue. The bride never spoke to the groom again, and it took her years to heal from that betrayal. Story 17. I once witnessed a wedding disaster that nobody could have predicted. The couple had been engaged for almost 2 years, and the bride, who was very meticulous about every detail, had planned this wedding down to the last detail. The ceremony was supposed to be in a beautiful cathedral, with hundreds of guests arriving to witness their vows. Everything went smoothly at first, until the vows were about to be exchanged. The bride stood at the altar, smiling at her groom, who was also grinning. The officiant began asking them if they took each other as partners in life, and when it was the groom's turn to respond, he hesitated. Suddenly, he dropped his hands to his sides and said, "I can't marry you." The entire room fell into a shocked silence. The bride, looking confused, asked him why. The groom explained that the night before the wedding, he had been contacted by his ex-wife. They had been separated for a while, but she had asked him to reconsider and come back to her. He admitted that he'd been having second thoughts for months but didn't know how to call off the wedding. The bride's face turned as white as a ghost. She just stared at him, shaking her head in disbelief. She asked if he was serious, and he said he was. Then, without another word, he left the church, leaving the bride standing at the altar. The bride, who had been planning the wedding for so long, was utterly crushed. But then, a moment later, she turned to the guests and said, "I can't marry someone who doesn't truly want me." The guests were stunned as she walked away, followed by her maid of honor. The groom didn't even try to chase her. The wedding was officially called off, and people slowly began to leave the venue. The bride later filed for an annulment, and the groom tried to get back with his ex-wife, but the damage was done. The wedding was completely ruined and no one saw it coming. Story 18. This one is truly bizarre. I attended a wedding where, just moments before the bride walked down the aisle, the groom's mother burst into the ceremony. She rushed up to the front of the church and shouted, "I forbid this wedding!" It was completely out of nowhere, and nobody knew how to react. The bride, who was standing with her father, was stunned. The groom, standing at the altar, was visibly embarrassed, but his mother wasn't done yet. She began explaining that she had been having an affair with the bride's father for years. This bombshell was completely unexpected, and everyone in the church was absolutely silent. The bride's father, looking embarrassed but not entirely surprised, didn't say a word, but the bride, upon hearing this, began to break down in tears. The mother continued to explain that she hadn't told her son about the affair because she wanted him to marry the bride, but now that the truth had come out, she couldn't bear the thought of him marrying. The groom looked torn, not knowing what to do. The bride, furious and heartbroken, turned to her father and demanded an explanation. In a fit of rage, the bride called off the wedding. She yelled at the groom's mother to leave and told her father that she never wanted to see him again. The groom, clearly ashamed and confused, tried to apologize, but the bride wouldn't hear it. The wedding was officially called off, and the guests slowly began to file out. It was a wedding nobody would ever forget. Story 19. This one took place at a luxurious wedding venue with about 200 guests, all there to see the perfect couple get married. The bride was beautiful, the groom was handsome, and everything was set for an elegant ceremony. The problem began when the groom's ex-girlfriend showed up unexpectedly. She wasn't invited, but somehow she managed to slip past security and made her way to the front of the church. As the bride walked down the aisle, the ex-girlfriend stood up and shouted, "I'm pregnant with his child!" The entire room gasped. The bride froze, and the groom, who was already sweating nervously, turned pale. The ex-girlfriend explained that she had recently discovered she was pregnant and that the groom was the father. She claimed that she had tried to get in touch with him, but he had ignored her, and now she was letting everyone know the truth. The bride, feeling betrayed and devastated, demanded that the groom explain himself. The groom, looking like a deer caught in headlights, admitted that the ex-girlfriend's claim was true. He had been involved with her for months before the engagement, but thought he could hide it from everyone. The bride, shocked and horrified, turned to leave, but the groom tried to stop her. With a mix of anger and disbelief, the bride announced that the wedding was over. She stormed out of the church, and the guests, still in shock, began to trickle out. The groom stood there, dumbfounded, as the ex-girlfriend left with a smug expression on her face, knowing she had ruined everything. Story 20. A friend of mine was a guest at a wedding where the bride called it off over a very unexpected reason. The couple had been together for about 6 years, and their wedding was meant to be the ultimate celebration. The ceremony was set in a gorgeous garden with flowers everywhere, and the guests were all excited to witness this union. But as the bride walked toward the altar, she noticed something strange. Her fiancé, who had been standing patiently waiting for her, looked pale and was trembling slightly. The bride asked him if he was okay, but he insisted that he was just nervous. As the ceremony progressed, the bride started noticing more odd behavior. Her fiancé was acting jittery and kept looking at his watch. Right before they exchanged vows, the groom turned to her and said, "I can't marry you." The bride, confused, asked why. The groom then confessed that he had been struggling with a gambling problem for years, and recently he had been gambling away large sums of money. He had even sold some of the bride's family heirlooms to pay off his debts. The bride was in shock, and without hesitation she turned to the guests and declared the wedding was off. The groom, begging for forgiveness, tried to stop her, but she had already made up her mind. She walked away from the altar, and the groom was left standing there in front of all their family and friends, humiliated. The wedding was canceled, and the guests awkwardly left, not knowing what to say. The bride later filed for a divorce before the marriage had even started and left the groom to deal with the fallout of his own mistakes. It was a sobering reminder of how quickly things can go wrong when you hide a secret. Story 21. A colleague of mine had an experience at a wedding that was like something out of a movie. The bride and groom had been dating for nearly 6 years, and everything seemed perfect until the night before the wedding. The bride's best friend had been her maid of honor for years and had helped her plan everything. But what no one knew was that the maid of honor had been harboring feelings for the groom. On the night before the wedding, the maid of honor cornered the groom during the rehearsal dinner and confessed that she was still in love with him. The groom, caught completely off guard, was shocked and reassured her that he was committed to the bride. The maid of honor insisted that if he truly loved her, he would call off the wedding and be with her instead. The groom, feeling guilty and unsure, actually considered her offer. In the end, he told the bride the next morning that he needed to talk. When the ceremony was about to begin, the bride, seeing that the groom was acting strangely, asked him what was going on. He told her that he couldn't marry her because he had feelings for someone else. The bride was devastated. She had been best friends with the maid of honor for years and couldn't believe what was happening. The wedding was called off and the guests were left confused and uncomfortable. The bride walked out, refusing to speak to either the groom or the maid of honor. That was the last time she spoke to her best friend. Story 22. This one took place in a small town, and it's one of the most awkward wedding disasters I've ever heard of. The bride and groom were high school sweethearts, and everyone expected their wedding to be a fairy tale. The ceremony was about to start in a beautiful, historic chapel, and all the guests were seated, eagerly waiting for the bride to walk down the aisle. However, the moment the bride entered the chapel, she froze. She looked up at the groom, then back down at the floor, and then she abruptly turned and ran out of the chapel. The guests were shocked, and the groom, looking bewildered, ran after. The bride was outside, crying. And when the groom caught up to her, she explained that she had just realized she wasn't ready to get married. Apparently, in the days leading up to the wedding, the bride started having doubts about her decision. She realized that she hadn't truly figured out who she was without the groom, and the idea of getting married just didn't feel right anymore. The groom, devastated and not understanding why this was happening, tried to convince her to go through with it, but she was firm in her decision. The couple ended up calling off the wedding, and the groom was left standing at the altar, broken-hearted. The bride decided to take a solo trip around the world to find herself, and the two of them lost contact for several years after that. Story 23. I once heard about a wedding where the bride's stepmother caused everything to fall apart. The bride and groom had been together for a long time, and the wedding was to be a grand affair, with hundreds of guests invited. The bride's biological mother had passed away years ago, so her stepmother had stepped in to fill that role. However, the relationship between the bride and her stepmother had been rocky at best. The night before the wedding, there was a huge argument between the bride and her stepmother. The stepmother, feeling like she wasn't being properly acknowledged, began accusing the bride of abandoning and only focusing on her father. Tensions had been building for months, and this argument was the final straw. The bride, fed up with the constant criticism, stormed out of the hotel room where they were staying and went to the venue by herself. She spent the night there alone, thinking about whether she truly wanted to go through with the wedding. The next morning, just as the ceremony was about to start, the bride walked up to the altar and whispered to the groom that she couldn't marry him because of the ongoing family drama with her stepmother. The groom, shocked but supportive, agreed to cancel the wedding. The guests, many of whom were confused by the sudden change, slowly began to leave the venue. The bride ended up having a long talk with her stepmother that evening, but the wedding was never rescheduled. It was a painful experience, but one that ultimately allowed the bride to gain more clarity about her relationship with her family. Story 24. This wedding disaster took place in a beautiful garden overlooking a lake. The bride was walking down the aisle when she suddenly stopped. The groom, looking nervous but excited, stood there waiting for her to reach him. But instead of continuing, the bride turned to face the guests and, in a trembling voice, said, "I can't do this." The groom was immediately confused and asked her why she wasn't continuing. The bride explained that she had just discovered that the groom had been hiding something huge from her for months. Apparently, he had been in contact with a woman he had dated before they got together and had been seeing her again behind the bride's back. The bride had discovered text messages between them, and she confronted the groom about it. The groom admitted everything and tried to apologize, but the bride was done. She turned to the crowd and explained that she could never marry someone who would betray her like this. With tears in her eyes, she walked away, leaving the groom standing at the altar. The guests were in complete silence, unsure of what to do. The groom tried to run after her, but she had already left the venue, and the wedding was officially called off. It was one of the most heartbreaking moments I've ever witnessed at a wedding. Story 25. This one happened at a very extravagant wedding, and it's a reminder that sometimes money can't fix everything. The bride and groom had spent nearly a year planning their dream wedding, with an impressive guest list, a lavish reception, and a wedding dress worth thousands of dollars. Everything was set for the big day, and the couple was ecstatic. However, right before the ceremony, the groom found out something that caused him to panic. A few days before the wedding, the groom's best friend had called him, saying that there was something important he needed to tell him. The best friend revealed that he had accidentally found out the bride had cheated on the groom. The groom, confused and angry, confronted the bride on the morning of the wedding, and she confessed that she had had a brief affair with someone at work. The groom, furious, told her that he couldn't go through with it. The bride tried to convince him that it was a mistake and that she had ended it before the wedding, but the groom couldn't shake the betrayal. In front of all the guests, he called off the wedding. The bride, embarrassed and in tears, ran out of the church. The guests were left in stunned silence, and the groom left shortly after, refusing to speak to anyone. The wedding planner tried to salvage the situation, but there was no going back. The bride later apologized to her family and friends, but the groom could never forgive her. The wedding was a complete disaster, and it was one of the most dramatic events I've ever been a part of. Story 26. I attended a wedding where everything was set for the perfect day, but it took an incredibly unexpected turn. The bride and groom were high school sweethearts, and they had been planning this wedding for over a year. It was supposed to be a beautiful outdoor ceremony with friends and family in attendance. The moment the bride walked down the aisle, her face was glowing, but she seemed a little nervous. The groom, standing at the altar, was smiling, but his expression quickly changed when he saw someone in the audience. The bride looked at him and immediately asked, "What's wrong?" He hesitated for a moment before saying, "I can't do this." The entire crowd went silent as he turned to the officiant and added, "I'm so sorry, but I'm in love with someone else." The bride looked shocked, and for a second she just stood there, trying to comprehend what he had just said. After a tense silence, he explained that he had been seeing someone else for the past 6 months and had been struggling with his feelings. He said he couldn't go through with marrying her out of guilt, and because he felt he wasn't ready for the commitment. The bride, heartbroken but incredibly composed, told him that she appreciated his honesty, but that she couldn't marry someone who wasn't fully in love with her. She walked away from the altar without a word, and the groom stood there looking completely embarrassed. Guests began to leave, some in tears while others were in disbelief. The bride eventually left the venue in her wedding dress, accompanied by her maid of honor. The wedding was called off and no one saw it coming. The groom tried to reach out to the bride afterward, but she refused to speak with him again. It was a painful ending to what was supposed to be a day of celebration. Story 27. A friend of mine was invited to a wedding in a small town, and it turned into a chaotic scene that no one could have predicted. The couple had been dating for over 5 years and were known for having a very solid relationship. The groom was an easygoing guy, and the bride was always bubbly and full of life. But just before the ceremony started, the groom's best man pulled the bride aside and said he needed to tell her something important. The best man revealed that the groom had been unfaithful to the bride several times over the course of their relationship. In fact, he had been sleeping with one of the bridesmaids for almost a year. The best man was clearly torn, but he couldn't live with the guilt anymore and had to tell the truth. The bride was speechless, and for a moment it seemed like time stood still. She asked him to repeat himself, and when he did, she just collapsed into tears. The worst part was that the groom had no idea what was about to happen. When the bride walked down the aisle, she immediately confronted the groom. She asked him if it was true, and he hesitated before admitting it. Without saying anything else, she turned to the guests and said, "This wedding is over. I will not marry someone who lies to me and disrespects me in front of all of you." The guests, some of whom were just as shocked as the groom, slowly began to leave. The groom stood at the altar, stunned and ashamed, unable to do anything. The bride walked out, her family and friends following her, and the entire wedding was canceled. The groom tried to apologize, but she never spoke to him again. Story 28. This one was a real shocker. The bride and groom were very well known in their community, and their wedding was set to be a grand affair with over 300 guests in attendance. The ceremony was being held at a historic mansion, and everyone was looking forward to a beautiful, elegant celebration. However, just as the bride was about to walk down the aisle, her father, who had been standing at the front of the church, suddenly collapsed. There was a moment of panic as the bride and her family rushed to his side, and an ambulance was called. The bride was visibly shaken, and the ceremony was paused as everyone awaited the arrival of medical professionals. While waiting for the ambulance, the bride's father regained consciousness and whispered something to her. It was a revelation that no one had expected. He confessed that he had made some poor financial decisions and had secretly used the bride's wedding money to cover up his gambling debts. He was afraid of being found out, and that's why he had been acting strangely in the days leading up to the wedding. The bride, already on the verge of a breakdown from the stress of her father's collapse, was now dealing with the crushing weight of the betrayal. She turned to her fiancé, who was standing in shock, and asked him if he knew about her father's financial struggles. He admitted he had suspected something, but he hadn't known the full extent. The bride, unable to reconcile her father's actions and the stress of the situation, made the decision to call off the wedding. The guests, who had been anxiously waiting, were told to leave as the bride and her family processed what had just happened. The groom, devastated, tried to talk to the bride, but she was too upset to listen. In the end, the wedding was officially canceled, and the couple never spoke again. The bride took a long break to recover from the ordeal, and the groom moved away from the town to start fresh. It was one of the most heart-wrenching wedding cancellations I've ever witnessed. Story 29. I attended a wedding a few years ago where a series of strange events led to the entire ceremony being called off. The bride and groom had been together for nearly 7 years, and everything seemed perfect. They had been living together for the last 3 years and had a beautiful home. The wedding was set in a charming chapel, and everything seemed to be going according to plan. That is, until the moment the groom entered the chapel. He looked nervous but happy, walking down the aisle with his groomsmen. But as he got closer to the altar, he stopped and suddenly turned around. The bride, who had been waiting anxiously, asked him what was wrong. The groom looked at her and, with a pained expression, said, "I don't think I can do this. I'm so sorry, but I can't marry you." The bride, clearly shocked and confused, demanded to know what was going on. The groom finally admitted that he had been having a panic attack for the past few weeks. He had been feeling trapped in the relationship and wasn't sure he was ready for marriage, despite what he had told her in the past. The bride, devastated, turned to the guests and apologized, saying that the wedding was being called off. The groom, visibly torn and brokenhearted, apologized too, but he couldn't go through with it. Guests slowly began to leave, some comforting the bride while others were completely in disbelief. The groom left the venue in silence and the bride walked away with her family, never speaking to him again. It was a confusing and painful situation that left everyone wondering how it could have all gone so wrong. Story 30. I've never been to a wedding quite like this one. The bride and groom had been together for almost 10 years, and their families were excited for the big day. Everything was planned down to the finest detail, and the couple had been through ups and downs but were sure they were ready to make it official. Right before the ceremony started, the bride's mother approached the groom privately. She had a nervous look on her face and asked him if he was sure about going through with it. The groom looked puzzled, but the mother explained that she had seen something disturbing in the groom's phone the night before. She had found flirtatious text messages from another woman, one who had been in contact with the groom for a while. The groom, red-faced and sweating, tried to deny it at first but then admitted that he had been seeing someone else for the past few months. He explained that it wasn't serious, but the bride's mother wasn't buying it. She told the groom that if he didn't call off the wedding, she would expose everything to the bride. The groom, feeling cornered, decided to do the right thing and told the bride what had been going on. He confessed his betrayal, and the bride, stunned and furious, made a public announcement to the guests that the wedding was canceled. The groom tried to chase after her, but she refused to speak to him again. The wedding was called off in front of everyone, and the guests awkwardly filed out. The bride later moved away to start over, and the groom was left alone with the fallout from his mistake. Story 31. I once attended a wedding that turned into one of the most bizarre events I've ever witnessed. The bride and groom had been together for nearly 8 years, and it seemed like everything was in place for their perfect day. The venue was a beautiful garden surrounded by greenery, and guests were seated eagerly, waiting for the bride to arrive. As the ceremony began, everything was running smoothly until the bride made her entrance. The groom, who was standing at the altar with a big smile, immediately froze when he saw her. His face went pale and he suddenly took a step back, stumbling a little. The bride noticed and immediately asked him if he was okay. With a trembling voice, he turned to the officiant and said, "I can't do this." The room went silent, and people started whispering to each other. The bride, shocked, asked him to explain. He confessed that, while he loved her, he had recently realized that he wasn't as ready for marriage as he thought he was. He admitted that he had been having second thoughts for a while, but had been too afraid to back out because of the pressure from their families and friends. He said he didn't want to go through with it out of obligation. The bride, clearly heartbroken but surprisingly composed, told him that she could not marry someone who wasn't fully sure. She turned to the guests, apologized for the inconvenience, and called off the wedding right there. The groom, devastated by his own indecision, tried to apologize, but the bride walked away with her family, leaving the groom standing alone at the altar. The entire event was called off, and the guests were left confused. Some of them left immediately, while others stayed behind, unsure of how to handle the situation. The bride later said she would have preferred if he had just been honest with her months ago, but that was a lesson she would learn the hard way. Story 32. A friend of mine attended a wedding where everything seemed perfect until the groom's mother decided to cause a scene that no one was prepared for. The bride and groom had been together for 6 years, and the entire wedding had been planned down to the smallest details. The ceremony was supposed to be held at a luxurious hotel and the reception was going to be grand. Just before the vows were exchanged, the groom's mother stood up from her seat and walked toward the couple. She had been sitting quietly in the audience the whole time, but everyone could tell that something was off. When she reached the front, she took the microphone from the officiant and without any warning declared, "I cannot allow this marriage to happen." The bride and groom were stunned. The groom's mother proceeded to explain that she had recently found out the groom had been secretly dating someone else during the months leading up to the wedding. The woman in question, she claimed, was someone who had been friends with the family for years and had been spending time with the groom without anyone's knowledge. She said the groom was being dishonest and was not ready for marriage. The groom, shocked by the public revelation, tried to deny it, but the mother had text messages and photos to back up her claim. He admitted to everything: the affair, the lies, and the secret relationship. The bride, devastated and betrayed, looked at the groom and simply said, "I can't marry someone who has no integrity." She turned and walked out of the venue, followed by her family and friends. The guests were left in stunned silence, and the groom was left at the altar, standing alone in front of the crowd. He tried to chase after the bride, but she was already gone. The wedding was officially canceled, and the reception was called off. The bride later said that it was better to find out now than to have spent a lifetime with someone she couldn't trust.